California and acquired his fear of flying, and he did not get over that fear of flying until he ran for governor of California and realized that even California is too big to drive around in, and if he's going to be serious about politics, he's got to put aside this fear of flying that he had. And that's an interesting little tidbit about Reagan, I think, that's, as I say, it doesn't pop up much in the biography, nobody mentions it much. Anyway, while he's on the train, people who travel with him from GE to handle his luggage and his arrangements would note that he always had a stack of books with him. They weren't novels, they were always these sort of serious, dry, non-fiction books. And we know from Reagan's speeches from the Times and some of his letters that a lot of these books were some of the early modern classics of the conservative movement and the free market thought, like Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, which comes out in the early 50s. Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom, we know he read. He read Whittaker Chambers' book Witness when it came out in 1952 or 53 and was able to quote long passages from memory 30 years later. He was so taken with the book. A little parallel, by the way, is both Reagan and Churchill had near photographic memories. Literally so in Churchill's case. He could recite 800 lines of Macaulay's The Lays of Ancient Rome, which he memorized as an 8-year-old. 60 years later, he could still recite them. One day challenged his crew on Queen Mary looking across the Atlantic Ocean. And Reagan acquired it partly from his acting training of having to memorize scripts quickly for movie scenes, I'm sure. But they both had a near photographic memory. Reagan, we know, was a charter subscriber to National Review in 1955. He also read the Freeman, the periodical of the Foundation for Economic Education. He reads Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom when it's published in 1958, and he works all these into his speeches. And so he's studying these books on his own, books that are being mostly ignored by the New York Times and Time Magazine, which are catching a following in the, at that time, very young and immature and barely forming conservative movement. And he, it's pretty clear that he was, a champion of those views when he gets to be president some years later. Another sort of little instance of a parallel between Reagan and Churchill is Reagan is the only president. I'm quite confident this is true. I haven't checked every word every president's ever said, but I'd be willing to make a large wager. Reagan's the only president who ever quoted Frederick Bastiat. You know who Frederick Bastiat is, aside from the Hillsdale people, no, your econ department. Frederick Bastiat was a famous French liberal, which means libertarian economist in the 19th century. Wrote attacks on socialism and central planning and things about free. Well, Reagan quoted him, as did Churchill. Used to quote Bastiat, especially in his early parliamentary career when Churchill was an advocate of free trade. He quoted Bastiat on free trade. And as I say, I doubt there are any other chief executives you can point to who quoted Bastiat, with the possible exception of Margaret Thatcher, who I'm sure is familiar with his work. And maybe right now that Václav Klaus, the Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia, I would be certain is familiar with Bastiat's work, and maybe I'll quote it at some point. He's a very intellectual guy that way. But that's pretty rarefied company. There's lots more to say about this, but I'll draw this to a conclusion, and then we can take questions and range widely across anything you want to. Ultimately, the reason for this compelling comparison between Reagan and Churchill is the Cold War. Remember that Churchill could be said to have announced the beginning of the Cold War with his famous speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. It was the famous Iron Curtain speech, where he says the Iron Curtain is falling across Europe. Harry Truman rides out on the train with him, playing poker and drinking whiskey for 2 days, because Churchill's out of office at this point, remember, but Truman knows this is an important moment. And just to sort of set the scene a little bit further, now as we look back on the Cold War as a sort of coherent story, the beginning, the middle, and the end, and bumps along the way, but in 1946 it was still very unclear exactly what was really going on. What was required of the United States, for example, which had never kept a standing army, that never maintained alliances, permanent alliances with Europe. And it was only 3 weeks before Churchill goes to Fulton that George Kennan sent the famous long telegram from Moscow, signed then by Mr. X, later printed in Foreign Affairs. It said essentially, here's the nature of the Soviet Union. It's expansionist in its ideology, but it can be contained if we have a deliberate policy, a policy that may take decades to work. This roiled the whole diplomatic world here and over in Europe. So Churchill says an Iron Curtain descended across Europe, and it's there in Fulton for the first time that Churchill makes an argument that's later central in his writing about the Second World War in his memoirs, that World War II would have been the easiest war in history to prevent had the Western democracies done the right thing. The phrase he used was, the war could have been prevented without the firing of a single shot. Without the firing of a single shot. If only the Western democracies had armed themselves sufficiently first and second, diplomatically stood up to the dictators. And as I say, he wrote that, dilated that theme in his memoirs of the Second World War. Well, then you fast forward your imagination to the early 1990s, after the Berlin Wall comes down, and Margaret Thatcher started saying over and over again that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War, in her words, without the firing of a single shot. And it occurred to me that the Iron Lady, as we call her, had the Iron Curtain speech explicitly in mind when she used those words, or chose those words to describe Reagan's achievement. And in my book, I go into this in some detail in a complete chapter about the parallels between Reagan and Churchill and the Cold War. Another area where Reagan was completely unconventional and different from almost all other conservatives was his view that the Soviet Union was a doomed system, that they were destined to collapse. That was not the view Nixon and Kissinger had. Nixon and Kissinger were conventional anti-communists, decent in the ordinary sense, problematic in many other more profound senses, which is why Reagan criticized them so severely in the mid-1970s. But they thought, ideological totalitarianism is a durable form of government. It's here to stay. We have to figure out a way to get along with them for the long haul. By the long haul, they meant decades, if not centuries. Reagan took the view, as did Churchill, that this kind of government is, and they both use the same phrase, it's against human nature. And anything that's against human nature cannot persist for very long. And so he would say these really radical things in his speeches that would upset the Soviets and also upset the New York Times. And it's always interesting to go back in the 1980s and you'd see Pravda, and then you'd read the New York Times, and they all said the same thing in their editorials. And I was always amazed this wasn't a greater source of embarrassment. But nonetheless, Reagan would say, as he did first in London in 1982, and he stole Marxist language flagrantly. He said, it's Soviet communism that's going to end up on the ash heap of history. When Marx said it was capitalism that would end up on the ash heap of history. So now Reagan's using their language. Really upset the Soviets. And then, of course, most famously, he called it the evil empire a year later. I think the communism collapsed faster than Reagan expected it to. But there was a deliberateness about their strategy, saying, we're not going to muddle through, we're not going to have a phony détente, we're not going to press them very hard. And we're going to do it on Churchill's lines. And I quoted Churchill on this point. We're going to arm ourselves sufficiently, and then we're going to be really tough in our negotiations with them. And as I say, the rest is history. And I will stop there, and we can free for you with questions, comments, arguments.
If you can please repeat the question.
I'll repeat the questions, yeah.
Just for the camera.
Right, yeah. No one ever wants to go first. Which biography did you read?
I can't remember the title off the top of my head. It's been a while.
Who was the author? Do you remember?
I have to go look it up.
Okay, that's all right. There's a lot of different authors.
It has been a while since I read it, but I've always been very fascinated with Churchill.
It's a great story. So much fun.
I'll go first.
Okay.
So a couple, but here's one. Before they died, both Nixon and Kissinger, Nixon and Ford, I didn't mean to do that. Nixon and Ford, I need to bury the man. Nixon and Ford said, Reagan didn't win the Cold War. Every president after the Second World War won the Cold War.
Oh, there is an element of truth to that. Yeah. Oh, sorry. There's more to your question.
And that was about it, really.
Did you hear Mal's question? It was, what do you make of Nixon and Ford saying it wasn't Reagan who won the Cold War as much as it was every president after World War II? There's a certain element of which that is correct. There's a reason why Reagan used to like to quote Harry Truman in his speeches. Remember that Harry Truman was the president for whom Reagan campaigned in person. He appeared on the platform of Harry Truman in 1948 when he was still a Democrat, which was quite a bit longer. Truman was the first Cold Warrior. He was the guy who really assembled. I mean, this again, we take this for granted now, but it really is quite astonishing the complete reorientation of America's foreign policy and thinking in the aftermath of World War II. So we didn't want to have World War III happen by neglect the way World War II arguably did, American neglect. But this is utterly foreign for America, and it's still part of the controversies today about our problems in the Middle East and everything else we're going to now. But and it became a bipartisan policy. It was not immediately evident in 48 or even 52 that the Republican Party was hugely enthusiastic about this. The Republican Party was split. Bob Taft, a great man, would often give a speech on foreign policy where you couldn't tell exactly where he came down on things. And so one of the important things is that Eisenhower comes in and essentially he establishes a continuity of our containment policy, as does John F. Kennedy, as does Lyndon Johnson, and Nixon starts to fiddle with Dayton, a whole separate subject. But then, what I think what's important and what the Ford and Nixon comment leave out is liberalism lost heart for the Cold War, for containment, largely out of the Vietnam experience, and then just general sort of intellectual flabbiness in the 1970s. So that by the time you got to 1980, the containment policy is a matter of deep partisan controversy in this country. It comes up both in over defense budget arguments, but also in arms control negotiations and how those should be conducted. So, as I say, when the New York Times is saying the same thing that Pravda is, Reagan has a two-front war. He's got adversaries overseas, and then he's got people at home who disagree violently with his policy and want to undermine it. So that consensus, I think that what happens is the consensus over the Cold War was eroded very badly by the time Reagan comes there, and then he returns really to the Truman-Eisenhower era, but much more forcefully than maybe. Circumstances are more favorable to him along parts. So, any other president you could have seen temporizing, reaching bad arms control deals, having more grain deals, and prolonging the life of the Soviet Union for another decade or more. So, by the way, what liberals like to say is, well, Gorbachev gets the credit. Time magazine said that. And look, my book, second volume I'm writing, I'm having a lot of fun with Gorbachev because ultimately my argument about him is he wasn't Machiavelli, he was Inspector Clouseau. It could have been no part of Gorbachev's purpose to see to the end of the Soviet Union. Period, full stop. And, coming into office, he was a reformer. And there's some truth to that. He saw this wasn't working. In his first Politburo meeting, he says, we need reform, we need more dynamism, we need more socialism. Margaret Thatcher is quoted as saying, we can do business with this man. What they don't quote from Thatcher is saying at the same time, but he doesn't understand. His system is the problem. And until he recognizes that, and some of his own advisors said, we have to have private property. Until we have private property in this country, we can't reform anything. You couldn't see that. But then finally, Gorbachev is another witness I put in the top. More than once at Reagan's death, before Reagan's death, he said, I'm not sure what happened, would have happened, had Reagan not been there. So the liberals, I say, all right, here's what Gorbachev says. He's your guy. He says I'm right. So, it's a long answer, but yes, sir.
I'm curious. Was there something dynamic about it? Oftentimes, with leaders, a significant aspect of it are their advisors, are their cabinet per se. Was there something dynamic that Winston Churchill, about the cabinet, about the members that they let advise them, that there was something dynamic, something similar between them that we might be able to glean something from?
The question was, what about the advisors both of these men had? And was there something important about the advisors they had and something we could learn from that? The short answer is no. Not there's nothing to be learned, but no, there wasn't something special about their advisors. Let me find for you in my notes. I've got this wonderful quote from Churchill's principal private secretary, John Cole. And the reason I like to use this quote is one of the things that was always said about Reagan is he's out of touch, he's stubborn, he lives in a world of make-believe. This is from conventional people who didn't really appreciate how unusual his imagination was and what his independent streak was. So there's this interesting quote from Colville about Churchill that I think also describes Reagan. If you switch the names out and apply to both men. Colville. Churchill has always retained unswerving independence of thought. He approached the problem as he himself saw it, and of all the men I've ever known, he was least liable to be swayed by the views of even his most intimate counselors. I'll pause here and say there were many times in the 80s when Reagan was the only person in the room with the senior staff saying, I will not agree to negotiate over a tax increase. Now, he yielded on that point a few times, and I have some theories about his strategy for approaching that. But there are even times when Ed Meese, his most ideologically close advisor, would be for a tax increase, and Reagan says, nope, I'm not going to do it, or at least not now. We never say not now, but that's what he was thinking, I think. To continue with Colville, many people made the mistake of thinking that somebody, it might be General Ismay or Professor Lindemann, for whom the prime minister had the utmost respect and affection, would be able to get something through. Pause again. The same thing was said by conservatives, frustrated conservatives in the 1980s. Reagan's being cloistered by his pragmatist staff like James Baker, later Howard Baker. And there's an element of truth to that. And they thought, if we could just get something to Ed Meese, we could just get something to Gary Bauer or Ken Cribb, somebody, a movement conservative in the White House, that maybe Reagan will do something about this. And it usually was not the case. Continue with Colville. Unless the opinion, whoops, wrong page here. Where'd page 7 go? Excuse me a minute here. Oops, look at my pages. Here it is, sorry. Okay. Unless the Prime Minister was himself impressed by the argument, pressure by others seldom had any effect. Better thing said about Reagan as well, he delegates everything and then doesn't really pay attention to details. I don't see how you can be president and not delegate stuff in a government this size, but never mind that. People think the president should be superhero executives like Jack Welch of GE, who, if you look closely, delegated a lot too. Anyway, continue with Colville. If a subject bored Churchill, he would pass it, however important, to somebody else for a decision, and would scarcely pause to consider the grounds on which that decision had been reached. But once his personal attention was engaged, he had to be convinced that his initial reaction was wrong before he could agree to change his line. He was open to persuasion, although it often needed courage to press the point. But he was never persuaded by the fact that those who argued a certain course were people whom he liked and respected. It's exactly the same thing about Reagan. Then finally, from Colville, which also applies to Reagan, there were indeed a number of occasions when Churchill showed a quite inexplicable facility for reaching the right decision on faulty logic and against all the best advice. You say this, exactly the same things were said about Reagan. I got a lot of other parallels. People, Reagan lives in this land of make-believe, a little Hollywood fantasy. Churchill's critics said the same thing about him. Well, we don't understand this guy. Advisors are important, but remember that advice doesn't come to a president or a chief executive of a company. Advice doesn't come in boxes labeled good advice, bad advice. There's the passage in Machiavelli's Prince. I forget exactly how it goes, but the prudence of the prince doesn't come from the advice he gets, but from the prince's prudence. Right? That person's got to have the judgment. And so, Jimmy Carter had some good advisors. He had some bad ones too. He had some good ones.